So here we are. We're curious about James Bond with Sue Belinda Meehan. 1300 222 612 is the phone number. Peter of Benarken has an odd fact that I've heard as well. Peter, roll it out for me and we'll see what we can find.
Hello, Peter.
Steve, how are you going?
Very
Fabulous.
well, thank you.
You know this fact. Sidney Cotton, the son of the Cotton family that had large rural holdings in Australia.
Yes.
During World War I, he went over to England to participate in the war. However, the connection to the James Bond theme is that he flew spy missions into Berlin just prior to World War I, and he was the last man out of Berlin prior to the declaration of war in 1939. And he was a friend of Ian Fleming, and his life is just amazing in what he managed to do during World War II. And there are so many similarities between the character of James Bond and Sidney Fleming.
Sidney Cotton.
Sidney Cotton.
Yeah, he's just an amazing individual.
So Fleming sort of cherry-picked elements of Sidney Cotton's real-life story and wove it into the narratives of the James Bond story, Peter.
He did indeed.
Sidney Cotton was an interesting man. He also brought out a lady by the name of Christina Skarbek, who was an English-Polish spy for Britain during World War II. And when Christina met Ian Fleming, he framed the character of Vesper Lynd.
You're kidding me.
No.
You're kidding me.
No.
She must have been a bit of a dish.
Oh, she was. She was absolutely gorgeous. Look her up on the internet. She assumed the English name of Christine Granville.
And Helen, we are talking today about Sidney Cotton.
Yes, Sally. Now, a couple of months ago, we actually mentioned that a bridge near Proserpine had been named the Sidney Cotton Bridge. Mm-hmm. And it was because Sidney Cotton was famous for developing the Sidcot flying suit.
Which, can I just say, I literally had never heard of until I read your notes.
No, and when you think people were using it from the First World War to the 1950s, it was an extraordinary invention. Now, during the week, I heard Steve Austin talking to Sue Belinda Meehan, and as a small part of their big conversation, they mentioned Sidney Cotton. So I thought, I think we need to have a closer look at Sidney. So I did, and there was a lot more to know. Now, Frederick Sidney Cotton, always known as Sidney, was born in 1894 at Allensley, near Bowen, which was a property which his mother's father had owned. Sidney's father had come to Queensland from the Channel Islands. Sidney was educated at the Southport School, and then when the family went back to England briefly at Cheltenham College. Now, in 1900, Sidney's father, A.J. Cotton, who was also a very interesting character, purchased Yost Vale from an Ipswich butcher named Philip Yost. So A.J. Cotton renamed the property Hidden Vale and took up residence in a hidden valley below the site of an old homestead. In 1913, A.J. Cotton took over Brunette Downs in the Northern Territory. Now, that was ambitious. But he vociferously advocated closer settlement, and that caused a lot of controversy, as it would have meant cutting up Brunette Downs. So Sidney's father retired to Tasmania. He became a noted yachtsman and ran an apple drying business. His varied business life was later echoed by Sidney's entrepreneurial exploits. A.J. Cotton's autobiography, With the Big Herds in Australia, was published in 1931, so he became well known. But after finishing school, Sidney worked as a jackaroo in New South Wales and returned to England to fight in the First World War. In November 1915, he was appointed a temporary sub-lieutenant in the Royal Naval Air Service. The Navy bit is important. Mm-hmm. And after only 5 hours of flying solo, he was flying BE-2C aircraft from Dover on patrols over the English Channel. Not long afterwards, he was flying on night bombing raids from bases in France. And it was in 1916-17 that he devised the Sidcot flying suit to keep pilots warm.
Now, I Googled it after I heard, and I know what it is, but I just didn't know it was called that, right?
No,
Yeah.
exactly.
Fascinating.
And I think a lot of people were surprised. But and civilians used it as well as the military until the 1950s. He had to come back to England because he was unwell. He was promoted, but he conflicted with his seniors and resigned. He had a problem with authority that really lasted his life.
Sydney Cotton, I feel ya. Helen Gregory is who we're hearing from. She gives us a slice of Queensland history, this time most Sundays, and today she's talking about the life and times of Sydney Cotton.
And he ran his father's apple drying factory in Tasmania for a while, went back to England in 1919. He tried unsuccessfully to fly from England to Cape Town. He crashed a plane in the English aerial derby. But from the late 1920s, he was in Canada, engaged in various businesses. He was based for 3 years in Newfoundland, where he worked as an airborne spotter for sealing companies, people who wanted to catch seals, which we wouldn't do now.
No.
An aerial photographer, that became very important. And he also ran an airmail service, and he supplied timber. He searched for missing people, including supervising the operation that rescued Augustine Courtauld from the ice on Greenland in 1931. But his career as a spy began in 1939. He was a civilian, but he was adopted by British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, in his capacity. Sydney carried out secret flights over Germany and the Middle East. This is right on the cusp of war. Photographing military installation. Only days before the outbreak of the war, he was still obtaining valuable naval intelligence. He posed to the Germans as a wealthy private aviator and film producer, and he collected lots of valuable information. He used Spitfires painted blue to fly undetected across enemy territory. And to be able to take better photos, he designed side bubbles on the cockpit. He rigged up cameras concealed with panels on his plane, and he could open the panels by pressing a button under the pilot's seat.
Wow.
And he had such trusting relationships with German officials that he sometimes departed from his advertised and approved flight path. Now, most people would never get away with that, but he was obviously a very persuasive character. He was even audacious enough to take photos of Hitler's personal yacht.
Whoa.
It was a bit cheeky.
Yeah.
But there's very good reason to believe that Sydney Cotton was very important in the development of the whole field of airborne reconnaissance. So his intelligence led to some very successful air raids on enemy sites, but he had to come back to England. He had to fly in a straight line, and his was the last civilian plane out of Berlin. Just made it.
Wow.
And in 1939, he met the author Ian Fleming.
Oh, my God. Was he a model for James Bond?
He was. And
So cool.
Ian Fleming was also working for Naval Intelligence, and they became very good friends. Now, James Bond is actually an amalgam of Sydney Cotton and other spies, such as the Master of Disguises, Sidney Riley, and the extraordinary playboy Porfirio Robarosa. And it's that amalgam that forms James Bond. But, even more interestingly, it is now thought that the character of Q, who supplied James Bond with all those wonderful gadgets, was also based on Sydney's love of gadgetry. And there were things like flame-throwing bagpipes, exploding toothpaste, and mini rockets in cigarettes. But he kept on conflicting with senior officers, so Sydney had to resign from Naval Intelligence in 1940. But he still was awarded an OBE in recognition for his work in airborne reconnaissance. He also assisted Air Commodore William Helmore to produce an airborne searchlight, which could illuminate enemy planes at night in the sky. He was supported by Churchill, but he did fall out with the authorities, and they really disapproved of the fact he flew people out of Paris just before the Germans took over the city. So he was a ladies' man, an entrepreneur, a pilot, and a super spy. But he also got on the slightly nefarious side of life after the war. He ran guns into India using second-hand Lancaster bombers. He led the high life. He was bankrupted after his venture in oil exploration in Saudi Arabia went wrong. That was more a matter of falling foul of local politics rather than not being onto a good concession. But he was often right when his more well-placed opponents were wrong. So it's probably right to think he was a bit arrogant and a bit conceited. He did make powerful enemies, but he was a man of great courage and energy and a sharp mind and a flair for improvisation. And I noticed that Professor John McCarthy, in writing about Sydney in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, says that in another age he would have made a splendid buccaneer. I think that's a really good description. He had an extravagant personal life. He was married 3 times.
Of course he was.
And had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. There are 2 books about Sydney. The first one, Aviator Extraordinary, the Sydney Cotton Story, has an addition to the title, As Told to Ralph Barker. So obviously Sydney had a part in that. That was published in 1966. But in 2002, Geoffrey Watson published Sydney Cotton, The Last Plane Out of Berlin. So that is possibly a slightly more objective account. But even though he lived on the other side of the world for most of his life, he didn't forget Australia. His papers are in the Australian War Memorial. He approached the memorial in 1966, 3 years before he died, and his third wife, Bunty, helped to organise the donation, which is held in the War Memorial's personal papers and private collections. He died in Sussex on the 13th of February 1969, but his ashes came back to Queensland, to the area which had been so much part of his growing up years. His ashes are in the Cotton family grave in the Talagalla Cemetery near Ipswich. Oh, Sally, by the way,
yes,
the origin of the name Talagalla is Latin, and it's the genus name for the scrub turkey.
Well, that would make perfect sense, I would think.
Just keep that in mind for the next pub trivia.
Okay.
Right. But there are 2 full-size graves with headstones at Talagalla. To the side of the top grave is a stone plaque for Sydney Cotton. It lists his 3 wives, acknowledges his career as a pioneer aviator, inventor and spy. There's also a heritage plaque with the story of Cotton's life. That plaque states that he marched to the beat of a different drum. I think we could only agree with that, but he was amazing.
Yeah, wow, what an interesting man. Sydney Cotton. I'm going to have to pick up one of those books, I think, Helen Gregory.
Yes, I think there's a lot more to know about Sydney.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Helen, thank you so much. Yet again, I've learned something.